I can actually start where, a lack of observations nearly caused a larger problem. And we were working at a shopping mall, and there was a retaliatory shooting. A bunch of guys came into the food court after a guy who had shot at them the week earlier, if I'm remembering correctly. And they just started unloading on this guy. And when we arrived, we only got a description of one guy. And so we told the cops about the one guy, and we got on the cameras and we started, heading out towards where the transit exit was, which is where he had gone. Um, when we got back down, we started interviewing people along with the police. We started managing the outer crowd. The cops were talking to the direct witnesses right there. Um, and one of the ladies in the crowd says, "Yeah, what about the second guy?" And my reaction was, "What second guy?" And she says, "I didn't see the guy in the blue." And I just threw, "No, man, you come with me. You're going to come talk to some police right now." And she wouldn't. She said, "Absolutely not. I don't talk to no cops." And I said, "You talk to me?" And she said, "Sure." And you gave me a pretty good description, actually, right down to the FUBUs, everything, right over to the cops. He's still sitting in the food court. He was literally sitting in amongst all the cops, etc. And they, of course, figured it out pretty quick, and they grabbed him, and he was still armed. So I'm going to start out, the question says, tell us about a situation where your observations prevented a larger problem. Well, in this case, I missed one pretty good. And it wasn't just me. It was everybody following on after me. It was my entire crew. It was my supervisors. It was everybody on the cameras, who didn't somehow pick up on the second shooter. And thankfully, they grabbed him. I have no idea if they got the first guy who left the scene. I have no clue. But slowing down once the emergency was over, instead of running around like a chicken with my head cut off, would probably have yielded better information faster. Had I taken my time, instead of just focusing on the video of the first shooter running away, I would have gone back to the actual shooting and realized, holy crap, this guy's off to the side. But yeah, he's waving a gun around too. Where is he? And if he had decided to shoot his way out, it would have been really bad. So am I to blame for that? No. Blame is something of the past. And unless you're about to invent a time machine, I submit to you that blame is useless. Responsibility is of the future. My grandfather used to teach me that. What are we going to do about this one the next time? All right, so I'm going to tell you about a couple of very, very common ones where my observations prevented a larger problem. We've been in all kinds of inclement weather situations. After having it happen once where a lady slipped in her high heels on a marble floor and broke her ankle, I've always taken that to heart now. Everywhere I go, what is the environment like? If it's going to rain today, how many times do you look at your weather app before you leave the house, figuring out whether you need to grab a jacket or not? Well, don't just let that observation end right there. So now when I get there, my briefing, even if I'm just briefing myself, just taking a moment while I'm having my coffee and thinking through what are going to be some of the potential routine problems here today. So environment is a huge one. We actually had a medical issue where I didn't necessarily go far enough. We had at a condo building I was assigned to for a couple of weeks, taking over from somebody who had just started her maternity leave. The maintenance guy had a bit of I'll call it a laissez-faire attitude about things. He wasn't too worried. He says, I haven't been hurt yet. And he would do things like mowing the lawn in flip-flops. And when I saw this, I was properly horrified. And I went belting out back and, whoa, hooray, buddy. And he goes, yeah, I know. And the girl before me, I guess, had spoken to him a couple of times about stuff like that and had documented that and passed that on to management, who had decided not to do anything about it. Because again, there hadn't been a problem. Why fix it until there's a problem? Well, wouldn't you know it, I guess third or fourth day, he's mowing the lawn, and he goes to start the mower. Didn't realize that it was already started. Ironically enough, he was wearing hearing protection. And his foot was underneath the deck of the mower. When he yanked the cord, it chopped a bunch of his toes off. And we were left with a real, I'll say it politely, uh-oh moment. He started yelling. And you learn the difference between somebody yelling at somebody about a parking spot or whatever. You go out there anyway when you hear that. When I hear raised voices, I tend to get up from behind my desk or wherever I am and go investigate. Why are there raised voices on my property? I prefer peace. Thank you. And I could hear him yelling out back, and you know the difference. Especially if you're a parent, you know the difference. You know, your kid yells from the other room, you can tell them, hey, be quiet. Or they start that panicked yell where they're hurt, and instinctively, get the heck up and start hustling. And on the way out, I grabbed the first aid kit, and the lesson I learned from that day is that first aid kits are not adequate to every situation. As a matter of fact, a lot of times they're extremely inadequate towards anything more than your routine nicks and cuts and, anything bigger than a hangnail, I like to say. Something you can talk to your boss about, improving the first aid kits. In any case, when I get out back, he is actually sitting cross-legged. He has his hand clamped over where the toes used to be. And I remember thinking, great, I'm going to have to go find toes. That's fantastic. And immediately my brain goes, idiot, what do you think you have firefighters for? Firefighters and paramedics are going to go find the toes. And so I grab the phone, start telling 911 about it. And at that point, I'm trying not to laugh. Now, before you think I'm mean-spirited, honestly, it is a bit of a funny situation. If this was in a movie or something, you'd, kind of chuckle and say, idiot, and move on. It's a natural stress reaction sometimes for people to start laughing. And I know that's mine. My first stress reaction in my facials can be, whoa. So I'm aware of that now. And I go instantly blank when I hit a situation, because I don't want somebody who's observing, or God forbid, the patient or the victim at that point, to think I'm laughing at them. That's really going to reduce their faith in you at that point when you need it the most. Plus, they're not going to like you very much when they come back to work, etc. So, relatively minor problem there. In any case, 911's on the way. The dispatcher, they've heard all this before. They're saying, yeah, that's okay. I've already got an ambulance on the way to you. Actually, the firefighters are coming. Are you able to go out front and meet them? And that's something that you can really be helpful with here, because when 911 is pulling up, they don't know your building. They don't know your property, certainly not as well as you do. And they have no idea where the actual incident is. They're getting a computer monitor that's telling them, it's at 123 Annie Street, Suite 318. What does that mean to them when they've never been there, right? So in this case, I'm able to go and meet them out front, and firefighters were there first, and walk them back to where he was still sitting cross-legged. And he was starting to lose a fair amount of blood. It was running down his feet, etc. So those situations are kind of gross. They're fairly upsetting. You're going to have a moment. Keep that to yourself. Okay, you don't want them to feel like it's their fault, or they've done something wrong. Very often an accident is just that. And then one of the firefighters said, yeah, thanks. Can you go tell the paramedics? And honestly, the paramedics were about 10 minutes later. And something you're going to learn is that your emergency is not the emergency in the city. There are other emergencies going on. There are bigger problems, bigger fish to fry in the city. So yes, sometimes help can be a little delayed, and you have to kind of manage and just tell people that and say, well, we're not the only incident in the city today. I'm sure they're pretty busy, but I know they're on the way. The dispatcher told me so. right? So now here they come, and his wife comes bouncing out, and she is screaming to beat the band. At that point, I figure, okay, this is my job, and I grab her and I say, hey, 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 it's okay, don't touch. They're treating him, and the paramedics were bandaging him up. Like, you can't believe how calm they are until you realize that, yeah, they've seen this dozens of times. They have seen people on the worst day of their life, and that's routine for them. So it's really, really comforting when you hear those sirens arrive to be able to think, okay, my job's not over, but this is where I start composing my report in my head. This is where I get my notebook out and start writing, just little point form observations. What's going on here? Let's get the, arriving unit numbers. Let's start writing down times. When was I first aware of this? I think approximately 3:30 p.m., and you can really start making life easier on yourself at that point. The emergency's over. You know, if it's not a lethal situation, and even if it is, it's not your problem, honestly, and that's not a cop out. It is now 911's problem. Even if it's a huge incident, it's now 911's problem. You've done your job. You've called them. You've gotten them to the scene. You've let them start their job in the correct place. So the upshot of it is, if it's a relatively minor situation, and it may be major to you, and it is definitely major to the injured party or the aggrieved party, somebody who's been robbed, et cetera, it is the event of a lifetime for them. They're going to be talking about this for years, but it is a relatively minor thing for you, provided you're uninjured at that point. So realize that. Take a moment to step back mentally and say, yeah, the pros are here. You're a pro too. You're a security pro. You're not a firefighter pro. You're not a paramedic pro. You're not a police pro, right? Leave it to them. Let them do it. They've seen this dozens of times, and even if they haven't, they know how to figure it out, and they know how to call their supervisors. Even cops, imagine this, sometimes have to call for help. They have to call the bomb squad. They have to call the ETF, the SWAT team, things like that. They have to call for air support when they're peeling off of a chase. There's all kinds of specialized police units that when cops say, uh-oh, right, they go off and they call these specialty units, and then they stand back and hold the perimeter and let the real pros go to work, right? It doesn't mean that anybody else is any less of a pro. You need to still have pride in your job. But don't try to be a cop. Don't try to be a firefighter. Don't try to be a hero. Just be a really good security pro. So observations preventing a larger problem would have been to be a little more insistent with the management, to say, look, this is going to lead to serious injury and liability. When the lawyers got involved, holy cow, I don't think he ever had to work again because of the settlement. And you may be thinking to yourself, why? He did it to himself. Well, there's things like failure to properly train, failure to properly supervise, and the property manager lost their job over that one. And frankly, I don't think I disagree with what happened, because that manager should have taken a lot more care for their employees. They should have been, borderline psychic. They should have been much more anticipative, trying to figure out what can happen. They should have been out from behind their desk. They largely lived in their office. You can't be a good supervisor in your car or in your office. You have to be out amongst your troops. And they would have been out there, and they would have had an eyebrow raising moment and said, yeah, you know what? Let's buy you some steel toe boots there, big fella. How about we get you some nice comfy work shoes? Be a great idea. So there have been a dozen small times when something that I've seen might have prevented a larger problem. Asking managers to put down winter runners, the rubberized carpets from the front door. And very often the objection is, well, they're ugly. And they are. But I can tell you what's uglier is we had a lady who came in from the cold in the winter, inclement weather. She was wearing high heels, and right in front of me. Dear Lord, her ankle turned, she stepped on the side of her heels, and she snapped her ankle. And in the moments following, when we were talking to my supervisors, we just sort of were a little glum, thinking, good Lord, if we just had a carpet runner, she probably would have been fine. It doesn't absolutely prevent everything. It could have still happened even on the runner. Now this poor lady, she's got to be in a boot for a while. She's probably going to have ortho problems, etc. And simple stuff like that. Patrols. The number of times I used to uh, be one of the shift leads at a fairly large urban university. And one of my nervousnesses was lack of patrolling. There were a lot of very stationary posts. And so I argued for, excuse me, I argued for fairly vociferously, and was able to convince leadership that we should just simply change positions every 15 minutes to half an hour, where somebody who's at one static position A moves to static position B. Static position B moves to static position C. And that way they're actually covering the ground in between their posts as well. And the number of times that we discovered, for example, people passed out, not always homeless either. Sometimes if you're doing that at night, you would discover a student, a young person who had had too much to drink coming out of the local pub and had passed out someplace, maybe behind a bush. And could that have turned into a larger problem? Absolutely. The number of young, attractive female students down there, and I'm not suggesting that sexual assault only happens to women. It does not. It happens to men far more than you think it does. But, there are criminals out there who prefer a target of opportunity. They're not tremendously organized. And if they came across an attractive young lady passed out on the ground, it would, to them, be like winning the lottery. There are very few of those people out there. If they are 1% of the population, I will eat the hat of your choice. And you have to remember that. The world is not filled with bad people. But by simply patrolling and walking around, we started finding incredible amounts. And perversely, the university provost said, how come all of a sudden there's these incident reports from security? What's going on? You guys are elevating the crime rate. And we had to kind of take her aside and say, ma'am, these crimes were happening before we started patrolling. They just went unreported. How many sexual assaults of students have gone unreported on your campus? And you had to provide a bit of a perspective to her, and then go back and apologize for my tone a little while later. And I said, but I'm very insistent about protecting my demographic, and that's somebody's daughter. So I learned to be a little more insistent as I gained some rank and a little more ability to talk back to management a bit. That's not something that a rank and file security pro should do. Know your chain of command, use it. Use it on paper. Doing paper reports properly about an observation that you've got is absolutely appropriate. And then nobody can come back later and say, well, this is your fault. You'll be able to point to that report and say, as per that date, I'd notified management about it. And then a follow-up a little while later if you see the problem has not been solved. You're not here to solve every problem, and there may be a reason, budgetary or otherwise, that problem is not being solved, why that solution is not being implemented. You might have had the greatest idea, but if they can't afford it this year, it's not happening. So try to be patient. Speak to your supervisor first, your immediate supervisor. Put it on paper. Remind them about it a little while later. Don't start going over their head. That's going to get you in a lot of trouble. Right? Respect the chain of command, but put these ideas on paper and speak to people about it. There's sometimes some unauthorized or not careful maintenance going on. There will be a lot of corners cut especially if you're working at a building that is under construction. And I have frequently gone to a construction foreman with my observations, saying, look, your guys are not properly grounded, et cetera. But I recognize that I'm not an expert, and I say so to them. I'm a security guard. I'm not an electrician, but it strikes me that using a metal ladder in this situation is probably not the greatest idea, right? Um, hey, did they turn in an incident report to you about the sparks that went flying earlier? Where somebody accidentally generated an accidentally closed circuit. Maybe nobody got hurt, but that's not okay for you to simply brush off. You take that to the appropriate people and you do a separate incident report. It's called a near miss. Any place where an almost accident happened, you're going to want to document that, put it on paper, and then call that to your supervisor's attention and say, hey, this incident report is a pretty good one. Can you give it a read when you have a minute? If you got any questions, you know where to find me. Right? Part of your shift handover. So you're working midnights, you won't necessarily see the higher ups. Tell your daytime relief. If they're coming in at 7 a.m., tell them about it. Give them chapter and verse and say, hey, listen, can you talk to the supervisor about this? Pass that on and call it to their attention. So I don't know necessarily that there's anything major or dramatic that I've done where observations prevented a larger problem, because if you've prevented it, you're not going to know about it. But I will really call attention to that university moment where I did sort of have to take on the top official in the university and point out why we needed to not be standing around protecting a little 2-foot square, piece of ground, where we did in fact need to be laying eyes on the entire university once an hour, just via a simple rotation. So don't be afraid to put your suggestions on paper. Don't be afraid to ask. If it's a cleaning issue, go talk to the cleaners. In a downtown property I worked, we started having a proliferation of discarded needles in the bathroom. And instead of just asking the cleaners to keep an eye on it, and the cleaners actually revolted a bit. They said, we're not trained for that. That's not what we're supposed to do. So we had to get together with the management and say, what are we going to do about this? The management solution was buy security a sharps bucket and tell them to do it. Which I'm okay with, but you may not be. Make sure you advise your security guard firm about anything where there's a potential threat to you. If you do, in fact, pick a needle up the wrong way and you get scratched by it, you could wind up with diseases, drug contamination, things like that. Simple solutions are usually the best. But at that point, since security was aware of it, between myself and my supervisor, we were able to say, well, what's going on? How are they getting in the building? This is not something that should be happening here. So we were able to be a little more proactive and start telling the guards, every time you start and finish a patrol, you're going to go down this hallway, which is in the back of the building. You're going to check that bathroom. When you find people, you're going to call for reinforcements, because drug addicts can be erratic. Again, remember, they don't know what they're doing sometimes, especially if they've just shot up and got high. They are definitely not in the same mind frame as you are. Bear that in mind. One of my supervisors said, consider yourself like you're talking to an alien. I'm not sure I buy that, because it kind of dehumanizes the person you're talking to, but nonetheless, I think she was correct. I think you effectively appear as an alien to these people. So we did have to, for quite a few days afterwards, intercept them before they were coming in and explain to them that, unfortunately, this can't be tolerated. And very often we would get, well, where do you want me to go then? And my initial retort, the little demon in my throat, would say, well, that's not my problem, is it? You can't do that. You absolutely cannot do that. You have to kind of keep it vague and say, look, you know what? Outside this building, I don't have any control over you. You are, of course, free to go and do as you like, but this is private property, and we can't have you doing that here. It poses a risk to our staff, etc. So I'm going to have to ask you to leave. And if we do catch you back here, we are going to have you arrested, and we'll arrest you for trespassing. And that means you are going to have to spend some time in the company of the police, which automatically to them becomes the biggest threat because they can't get drugs. And something I learned when I went and got my first responders certification is that drugs are as important as the air they breathe to them. One of my supervisors had a very interesting story or a thought during training. She looked at us and said, imagine that I controlled all the oxygen on the planet. You have to buy all your oxygen from me. If you don't buy from me, you don't breathe. What would you do in order to get the money to pay me so that you could breathe? And she said, if your answer was anything other than anything I have to, then you're not thinking the problem through all the way through, and you're not using your empathy. And she says, now I want you to apply that to drug addicts, to alcoholics, etc., to people who have behavioral issues, sex addicts, things like that. I want you to imagine that they absolutely cannot do without this substance or behavior, that it's as important to them as breathing. And what will they do to get the money in order to get that substance, in order to indulge that addiction? Absolutely anything, including going through you. So I think how to prevent problems is very much, and I'm going to sound a bit like a broken record considering that you're already here doing some pretty good training. Be ruthless about your training. Be ruthless about your listening. Absolutely, you do not know everything. Neither do I. I am still learning stuff like you wouldn't believe just from listening to people. Heck, I've learned stuff from social media posts where I've taken the time to verify them, look through and talk to the experts I know and say, hey, is this true? You guys actually do this? And then I'm able to start preventing those problems. And again, you might not know that you've prevented a problem because the non-existence of a problem has absolutely no evidence for you to rely on, right? But take it from me. If you are just a security guard, someone who just wants to sit on their desk, thumb through their social media, and do absolutely nothing, if you're somebody who doesn't care about getting promoted, etc., you will be what you will be. But a security professional is ruthlessly curious. I talk to the cleaners. I listen to management. I try to figure out, since I'm right in the middle of everybody's problems, and I'm usually the first one that people report to for a problem, I make sure that my listening skills are on par. I make sure that I touch base with everyone I can during a day. And I make sure that I ask, hey, anything going wrong? Is there anything that I can help you solve? How can we make this building better? How can I make your day better? Things like that. I'll take lunch with them. I'll sit down amongst the cleaners and I'll listen. I'll talk to them. And man, you can learn a lot of stuff about your personal life through them too. But I think that your desire for education, evidence you're being here, is actually going to prevent you from a lot of messes in your career. So I want you to continue that training, that ruthless desire for education, that hunger to be better. Don't lose that. Thankfully I never have. I've had some people call me naive and tell me I need to back off and be a little less intense. And, my response to that is usually, no, sir. I can't do that. I am dedicated to solving your problems. And, you might just have to put up with me. So thanks for listening there. And hopefully you're going to be a very, very active security professional, and you're going to never know what you've prevented into the future. But rest assured, you have.